Now, back to the Voice, and as you know, it'll be unlikely for any referendum to succeed unless there is bipartisan support. The opposition has kept an open mind, and as I mentioned, they did all the work to design a form of a voice that could be legislated back in their last term. The Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, Julian Leeser, travelled with the Prime Minister to the Garma Festival on the weekend. Leeser has long been an advocate for the Voice, but he wasn't the Shadow Minister then. He's back in Canberra now, and I asked him earlier, now that the government has outlined the proposed constitutional change, can the coalition back it?
Chris, thanks for having me. I've long been interested in this issue, you're right, and I've been involved in it. And it was good to see the government put forward a question and a proposed amendment that it's got, and we'll be looking at it, as will all Australians. But there's some big details that the government hasn't let us in on yet, and we want to hear from them. We want to understand how the voice bodies will work. Who will serve on them? How will they be chosen? What will their powers be? And how will they make lives of people in Indigenous communities better and address the issues that face them, whether it's domestic and family violence, whether it's poor education outcomes and poor employment outcomes, whether it's poor health outcomes. They're the issues that we want to hear about.
They're very important points, but and I'll come to them in more detail in a moment. But first up, can you live with that those suggested amendment words, the clausing, the phrasing to the Constitution? Is that acceptable to you?
Well, we've only just seen them at the weekend. I'll be talking to my colleagues about them. I'll be listening to legal experts. And in my role as Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, obviously listening to Indigenous Australians in their views on them. And so putting some words out there is a good start. It enables you to have a debate, it enables you to look at these issues and so on. But the words are just the words in the Constitution that enable the body. We want to understand how the body works, because you can't have a proper debate and discussion about this unless you've got the details about how the body itself will work.
Yeah, well, there's important stuff to talk about there. I want to hold up this document here that you'll be very familiar with. It was the work of your own government. This is the Indigenous Voice co-design process, tabled about a year ago, as I said, under the auspices of the Morrison coalition government. This looked, and declaration, I was involved in this process, but this gives you all the detail you need to formulate a voice. Now, sure, Anthony Albanese and his government haven't told us yet exactly how much of this work they've put into practice, but you would accept surely that this would be the basis for whatever they do, whatever laws they draft.
Well, I've been saying for some time that I think that the government should respond to the Calma-Langton report. And if you read the Calma-Langton report, and I acknowledge your work in that inquiry too, Chris, you'll see that the recommendation that they made was actually you need to start with the local and regional bodies. And in government, we committed $31.8 million for the rollout of the local and regional bodies. They also suggest in that report that it'll take at least 3 years to roll out those local and regional bodies before you deal with the national body. Now, the government's obviously got a very different timetable for all of this. And that's why we're asking questions about the detail. That's why we're asking, what do they like in relation to Calma-Langton? What do they not like? What would they go down in terms of their own path here? And I think Australians need to understand that. They need to understand that before we can be presented with these questions at a referendum.
Look, I think you're right. We've got to have a draft bill from the government showing how they would put the voice together. As I say, it's likely to draw heavily from this report, so anyone who's really interested should read this report. It's available online. But it gets to a more fundamental point here, doesn't it, Julian, Leeser? And that is, with this constitutional wording that I think most people would be satisfied with, most constitutional conservatives, it just says there should be a voice and it should make representations to government. Obviously, its advice is not binding. The point is, whatever Labor puts forward, then you would be able to, if you form government after the next election or subsequently, you would be able to change it, reform it. In fact, there's obvious an expectation over time it would need to be changed as the issues evolved or as things develop. So you should be comfortable with the constitutional amendment, because you know if Labor's voice wasn't quite what you wanted, should you get into government, you would be able to alter it through Parliament.
Well, that's the nature of having things in legislation, Chris, but it's one thing to have these provisions in the Constitution that set up what might be a theoretical body. It's another thing to understand from the government exactly what they'd want the body to do. And I think what they would want the body to do actually helps inform the debate we might have about the referendum. I mean, if you go back to the report that Pat Dodson and I co-chaired in 2018, we suggested that the co-design process be finished first, and then they look at the legal form, and whoever was in government look at the legal form. In some respects, the co-design process has finished, and rather than sort of rolling out the legal form of these bodies, they're saying, well, we'll go straight to the amendment bit. I think it's important that they also roll out the legal form of what the national body would be, because that is the best way that you can answer the reasonable questions that Australians are asking about this.
There are reasonable questions. Now, if you could summarise them, I suppose you want to make sure that the voice gets grassroots representation, that it's not a matter of the Sydney or Canberra-based elites, because we've had enough of that. There's got to be grassroots representation of Indigenous perspectives on these issues, and also it needs to be practical. This is not symbolism. The voice is only worth doing if it can help deliver better health, law and order, education, employment outcomes for Indigenous people, whether they're in regional cities, remote communities, or in towns and suburbs around the country. Is that the judgment by which you will assess the extra detail that comes forward?
Well, I certainly agree with you on all of those points, Chris. I think that is right, and that's why we want to see the detail. We want to see how the government might go about looking at it. I think your committee did a pretty good job. I should say for myself, I don't love everything in the report. There are some things that I would do differently, but we're not the government. And this is the government's proposal, and it's for the government to come forward and have the first go, as it were.
All right, let me put it to you in a final question. It won't be our final question on this issue in the months to come, but just for today. To me, there are two options here for the coalition. One is to try and be the spoilers and knock this down and oppose it outright. And with something as complex as that, it's not such a difficult task, possibly. The other is to engage in the process and make sure that it is representative, that it is grassroots, that it does focus on practical outcomes, and that it doesn't mess too much with our constitution. Which of those options do you think the coalition will take?
Well, we've come to this with an open mind, Chris. That's the position that we've taken, and we want to give the government the space to develop their proposal and to get the detail, and we're open to any consultation on this, as we're doing ourselves. I'm talking to my colleagues, I'm talking to Indigenous people as I go around the country, and I'm talking to legal experts as well, and I think that's the right approach for us to take.
Thanks for joining us today, Julian.
Thanks for having me.